The diesel engine coughed twice before catching, and I remember thinking that sound would become the most important noise in my life. I was halfway through my morning run across the Columbia when the radio started screaming about attacks in Portland. Not accidents, not a gas leak. Attacks, plural. The kind where people were tearing into each other with teeth and not stopping when security intervened. My hand stayed steady on the wheel, because 23 years of piloting ferries teaches you that panic gets people killed. The water was glass smooth that morning, reflecting clouds that had no idea the world underneath them was fracturing. I had 42 passengers aboard, commuters mostly. 3 of them were already on their phones, faces going pale, and I knew whatever was happening had jumped from the radio into their personal lives. The terminal on the North Bank came into view, and I could see someone running along the dock. Not jogging, running like something was chasing them, except nothing was there. I throttled down and started the approach, following the same trajectory I'd taken 4,000 times before, while my brain cataloged everything wrong with what I was seeing. The runner collapsed halfway down the pier, got back up, collapsed again. By the time I tied off, 6 more people had appeared from the parking area, and their movements had that same wrong quality: jerky, aggressive, hunting. I got everyone off the ferry in under 3 minutes, which was a personal record born from the sick feeling spreading through my gut. The collapsed runner was still on the pier, twitching now, and there was blood pooling around their head from where they'd split their skull on the concrete. One of my passengers, a guy named Marcus who commuted to his warehouse job 3 days a week, grabbed my shoulder and pointed toward the terminal building. The door was swinging open and shut, like someone kept almost making it through but couldn't complete the motion. I told everyone to get to their vehicles and leave. Not calmly. I didn't have calm anymore. I shouted it, used my captain's voice, the one that cuts through engine noise and weather. Most of them ran. 5 stayed frozen, staring at their phones, at the terminal, at the blood spreading across the pier. That's when the runner's body stopped twitching and went completely still for about 4 seconds before it stood up in a way that didn't involve normal muscle coordination. It faced us. Its eyes were wrong, clouded over like spoiled milk, but tracking movement with predatory focus. Marcus said something about calling an ambulance. I was already backing toward the ferry, pulling the keys from my pocket, calculating whether I could get everyone aboard before that thing reached us. It charged. Not stumbled. Not shambled. Charged with speed that seemed impossible for something that had just cracked its own skull open. I shoved the nearest person, a kid who couldn't have been more than 19, toward the boat and screamed for the others to move. 3 made it aboard. 2 didn't. I heard the screams behind me as I fired the engine. Not bothering with startup procedures, just cranking it and praying the cold diesel would catch. It did. The thing that used to be a runner was on top of someone, and the sounds coming from that struggle weren't sounds I'd heard before, outside of nature documentaries about predators. I released the lines with shaking hands, let the current start pulling us away from the dock, and pushed the throttle forward before we'd properly cleared the slip. The hull scraped concrete. Didn't care. The 3 people I'd saved were hyperventilating on the deck, and through the terminal windows I could see shapes moving with that same wrong coordination. The kid was crying, asking me what was happening, and I told him I didn't know, because that was the truth. The South Terminal was chaos. Cars everywhere, people shouting, and smoke rising from somewhere in the parking area. I brought the ferry in anyway, because the alternative was staying on the water with no plan and limited fuel. The moment I tied off, people started rushing the boat, not orderly boarding. Rushing, panic in its purest form. I had to physically block the gangway, using my size and my voice, explaining that the boat held 60 maximum, and we'd sink if they didn't organize. Nobody was listening. A woman with blood on her jacket fought past me, dragging a kid who might have been 7. A man in a business suit shoved an elderly guy out of the way hard enough that the old man went down. I grabbed the suit by his collar and threw him backward off the ramp, which started a shouting match that turned into shoving until someone fired a gun into the air. Everyone froze. The shooter was a sheriff's deputy I'd seen around. Older guy with gray in his beard, and he looked as terrified as everyone else, but at least he had a weapon and the authority that came with a uniform. He told everyone to form a line. Single file. Families first. It almost worked. The things that used to be people came out of the parking structure in a wave. I counted maybe 20 before I stopped counting and started moving. The deputy fired 4 shots, dropping 2 of them, but the others didn't even hesitate. They just kept coming, climbing over their fallen, reaching for the nearest living person with hands that grabbed and pulled and tore. The crowd broke. Half ran for the ferry, half ran toward the road. The ones who ran for the road didn't make it far. I got the gangway pulled up with maybe 30 people aboard. Way over safe capacity. But safety was a concept that had stopped meaning anything in the last 40 minutes. The deputy made it aboard last, jumping the gap as I released the lines, and we drifted away from the dock while those things piled up at the edge, some falling into the water where they sank immediately because they didn't have enough brain function left to swim. The kid from before was sitting against the cabin wall, rocking back and forth. The woman with blood on her jacket was checking her son for bites with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. Marcus was standing at the rail staring back at the terminal, and I knew he was thinking about someone he'd left behind, because I was thinking the same thing. My wife Claire was in Seattle at a medical conference. My son Jake was supposed to be at university in Eugene. I had no way to reach either of them because cell service had gone from spotty to non-existent, and the ferry's radio was picking up nothing but emergency broadcasts that kept cutting out mid-sentence. I piloted us to the center of the river and just held position there, letting the current work against the props, keeping us stationary while I tried to think. Both terminals were compromised. The north bank was overrun. The south bank was overrun. But I had 2 ferries, keys to both, access to the fuel depot, and a 1-million-gallon tank that serviced the commercial traffic. I also had the only functional crossing for 90 miles of river in either direction. The nearest bridge was collapsed according to the last coherent radio report taken down by a pileup of vehicles trying to escape Portland. The next ferry service was in a town that had gone silent 3 hours ago, which meant everyone who wanted to cross this section of the Columbia River would have to come through me. The deputy, whose name turned out to be Frank, came into the wheelhouse and asked what my plan was. I told him I didn't have one yet. He informed me that I needed to develop one quickly, because we had injured people, limited supplies, and nowhere safe to dock. I looked at the instruments. 3/4 tank of fuel, enough for maybe 12 hours of operation. The other ferry was moored at the north terminal, probably accessible if we were fast and smart. The fuel depot was on the south side behind a chain-link fence with a padlock I had a key for. The terminal buildings themselves were defensible if we could clear them. Concrete construction, limited entry points. Supplies inside including first aid kits, emergency rations, and tools. Frank was watching me work through it, and I saw the moment he understood what I was thinking. He asked if I was seriously considering holding the terminals. I told him I was considering staying alive, And that meant controlling the only strategic asset we had. The crossing, the boats, the fuel. Everything else was already lost. Frank nodded slowly, processing the implications, and asked what I needed from him. I told him I needed him to organize people into something resembling a functional unit, because I was a ferry operator, not a leader. And I had no idea how to command 32 terrified civilians through an apocalypse. If you've ever felt trapped by a choice you couldn't undo, you'll understand why I'm telling you this. Keep watching and subscribe. We took stock of what we had. 32 people scattered across the deck in various states of shock and terror. The deputy had his service weapon with one spare magazine. Another passenger, a younger guy named Derek who'd been heading to a construction job, had a hunting rifle in his truck back at the terminal with a box of ammunition he'd never retrieved. 2 people had knives. One had a baseball bat. Everyone had phones that didn't work, and fear that wouldn't quit. I gathered them on the deck and explained the situation in terms nobody wanted to hear but everyone needed to understand. We could try to run, burn our fuel heading upriver or down, hoping to find somewhere safe. Or we could fortify the terminals, establish control of the crossing, and become the gatekeepers for whatever came next. The silence that followed was heavy enough to sink the boat. Then Marcus asked the question everyone was thinking. What gave me the right to make that call? I told him nothing gave me the right, except the fact that I was the only one who could pilot the ferries, access the fuel, and knew the river well enough to navigate it in any conditions. If someone else wanted to be in charge, they were welcome to try. Nobody volunteered. The woman with the bloody jacket, whose name was Lisa, asked what happened to people who wanted to leave. I told her they could leave any time they wanted, but they'd be on foot because the boats stayed with whoever controlled the terminals. A guy in the back, maybe 40 years old with glasses and a torn shirt, accused me of holding them hostage. Frank stepped in before I could respond, explaining in a tone that allowed no argument that hostages implied captivity, and everyone was free to swim to shore and take their chances with the infected, if they preferred that option. Nobody took him up on it. We developed a plan born from desperation and the limited options available to people who'd watched civilization collapse in less than 4 hours. Hit the North Terminal first, because it had been overrun more recently, which meant fewer of those things would have had time to establish themselves inside secured areas. Secure the second ferry. Use both boats to create mobility and flexibility for whatever came next. Then tackle the South Terminal, clear the buildings, and establish a defensive perimeter around the most valuable strategic asset within 100 miles. Frank took charge of organizing people into groups, fighters up front, which consisted of himself, Derek without his rifle, 3 other guys who claimed they could handle themselves, and me. Everyone else would stay on the boat until we confirmed the terminal was clear. Lisa asked what happened if we didn't come back. I told her to take the boat south and don't stop until she hit the ocean. She didn't look comforted by that answer, and I didn't blame her because it wasn't meant to be comforting. It was meant to be realistic. The approach to the North Terminal required precision I wasn't sure I still possessed. My hands had developed a tremor that made the wheel harder to control, and exhaustion was settling into my bones despite it only being mid-morning. The pier was still visible through the spray, and the gray light still had bodies on it, and some of those bodies were moving. Not many, 3 that I could count. But 3 was 3 too many when you're essentially unarmed and running on adrenaline and borrowed courage. I brought us in slow, using the current to help position the ferry, and managed to kiss the dock with barely a bump. Frank went first, gun drawn, moving with practiced efficiency that came from decades of law enforcement. The first of those things came at him from behind a utility box, and he put it down with a single shot to the head that echoed across the water like a declaration of intent. The second and third came together, coordinating in a way that suggested some primitive pack-hunting instinct remained even after everything else had burned away. Frank got one. Derek grabbed a fire extinguisher from the dock and caved in the other's skull with it, then vomited immediately after, which I considered a completely reasonable response to having just killed something that used to be human. The terminal building was worse. We cleared it room by room, finding 2 more of those things, and 4 people who'd been torn apart but hadn't reanimated yet. Frank put bullets in their heads before they could turn, which started an argument with one of our group about whether that was murder or mercy. The argument ended when one of the bodies started twitching, and everyone understood that mercy and murder had become the same thing in certain contexts. After that, nobody questioned the protocol. The second ferry was exactly where I'd left it, tied to the far dock, keys in the office safe that only I had the combination for. Getting it started took precious minutes while the others kept watch, weapons ready, scanning the parking area and the access road for movement. The engine turned over clean, and I experienced a brief moment of relief that felt almost painful in its intensity. We now had 2 functional boats in control of 1 terminal. Progress measured in inches, but progress nonetheless in a world that was measuring everything in losses. Transferring everyone to the North Terminal took 2 trips because I refused to overload either boat beyond safe capacity, even though safety was relative and capacity was negotiable when weighed against survival. We used the time to start fortifying. The chain-link fence surrounding the terminal property was intact, 8 feet tall with razor wire on top that suddenly seemed far more valuable than its original purpose of deterring casual trespassing. The gates were wide open and would need to be secured. The building itself had solid doors, working locks and windows that could be barricaded with materials from the maintenance shed. The parking area held abandoned vehicles, some with keys still in them, that could be repositioned to create barriers and choke points. We had tools in the maintenance shed. We had supplies in the building. What we didn't have was food beyond vending machine snacks, medical supplies beyond basic first aid, or any guarantee that holding this position was anything other than a slower way to die while pretending we had control. Frank organized work details, while I focused on the boats and fuel situation. The North Terminal had a small fuel tank for emergency use, maybe 500 gallons, which would keep both ferries running for a few days, if we were conservative with crossings and didn't waste fuel on unnecessary runs. The main depot on the south bank was the priority, but hitting it meant crossing back over with a skeleton crew, and hoping we could secure it before dark brought complications we weren't prepared to handle. I volunteered to make the run because the boats were my responsibility, and I couldn't ask others to take risks I wouldn't take myself. Frank insisted on coming because he had the only functional firearm and the training to use it effectively. Derek, who'd proven himself with the fire extinguisher despite the vomiting, volunteered as well. Lisa asked if she could come because sitting around waiting made her feel like she was losing her mind, and I understood that completely, because action was a defense against thinking. And thinking led to contemplating Claire in Seattle and Jake in Eugene, and all the ways they might already be dead. 4 of us would cross, secure the depot, and assess the South Terminal situation. Everyone else would hold the North Bank under Marcus's coordination, which seemed optimistic given that Marcus was a warehouse worker with no leadership experience. But desperate times created leaders from unlikely candidates. If we didn't return by nightfall, they were to assume we'd failed and make their own decisions about survival. The crossing took 8 minutes in the smaller ferry. The south terminal looked deserted, which made it more threatening rather than less, because deserted meant uncertainty, and uncertainty meant potential ambush or hidden infected, or structural damage we couldn't see from the water. Deserted meant we were walking into a situation with no intelligence and limited backup. We tied off carefully, weapons ready, and approached the terminal building using vehicles for cover. The parking area was a graveyard of abandoned cars, personal belongings scattered everywhere telling stories of panicked flight, and bloodstains that had dried to brown crust in the sun. The building appeared intact from the outside. The fence was compromised in 2 places where vehicles had crashed through during the initial chaos. The fuel depot sat behind its own secondary fence about 100 yards from the main building. Padlocks still in place. Tanks undisturbed. Small mercies in a world that had stopped offering them. We cleared the terminal using the same room-by-room methodology, finding it mostly empty except for 2 of those things trapped in a maintenance closet that had somehow locked from the outside. We could hear them inside, scratching at the door, making sounds that weren't quite human but weren't quite animal either. Something in between, something worse than either. We left them there rather than waste ammunition, made a note to deal with it later when we had more resources and less immediate pressure, and moved on to the depot. The padlock opened with my key. The tanks were full, which meant approximately 1 million gallons of diesel fuel that would keep the ferries running indefinitely if we held this position. The pumps worked. The transfer hoses were intact. We could fuel both ferries, ration supply to generators, and potentially trade fuel to other survivors once trading networks emerged from the ruins. Derek pointed out that we could charge for crossings, establish rates based on what people could offer, create an economy centered on the only reliable river crossing in the region. The suggestion hung in the air uncomfortably because it implied futures and plans and systems that extended beyond immediate survival. And thinking that far ahead felt presumptuous when we hadn't even secured both terminals yet. Frank didn't comment on the economic implications. Lisa looked at me like she was waiting for a response that would tell her what kind of person I was going to become under pressure. Whether I'd be the guy who helped people, or the guy who exploited them. I said we'd cross that bridge when we came to it, which was a cowardly non-answer but the best I had, because I honestly didn't know what kind of person I'd become. Nobody knows until circumstances force revelation. We spent the afternoon fortifying the south terminal and transferring supplies between buildings. Medical kits from the employee break room, tools from the maintenance area, food from a supply closet I'd forgotten existed, mostly non-perishables purchased in bulk for employees, but enough to matter when you were feeding 32 people with no supply chain. We repositioned vehicles to block the fence breaches and create choke points that would funnel any attackers into killing zones if it came to that. We tested the radios, found them still non-functional for distance communication because whatever had knocked out cell service had probably damaged repeater towers, but they worked fine for terminal-to-terminal contact if we stayed on the same channel. By the time the sun started dropping toward the western horizon, we had both terminals secured to a level I would generously describe as barely adequate. Both ferries fueled and functional, and a group of 32 people who were looking to me for leadership I'd never asked for and wasn't qualified to provide. The first real test came that evening when a truck arrived at the north terminal, horn blaring with 6 people in the bed screaming to be let inside. Marcus radioed me for instructions. I was on the south bank. The decision was technically his to make, as the person physically present. But he wanted authorization, wanted someone else to carry the weight of command. And I understood that impulse completely, because command meant responsibility for outcomes. He asked what I would do. I told him to vet them carefully, check for bites, and only open the gate if they were clean. He asked how to check for bites if they were wearing heavy clothing and refused to strip down for inspection. I didn't have an answer immediately. Frank, standing next to me in the South Terminal office, took the radio from my hand and told Marcus to have them stripped to underwear outside the fence, conduct a full visual inspection, and refuse entry to anyone with suspicious injuries, regardless of their explanation. It was dehumanizing. It was necessary. It was the beginning of a protocol that would define everything that came after and transform us from desperate survivors into something more organized and consequently more cruel. Marcus reported back 10 minutes later. 5 were clean. 1 had a bite on his shoulder he'd been hiding under a jacket. That person was currently screaming at the fence, begging to be let in, swearing it was just a dog bite from before everything went wrong, insisting he was fine and healthy and not infected. Frank asked if the wound was fresh. Marcus confirmed it was fresh, still bleeding slightly, edges ragged in a way consistent with human teeth rather than canine. Frank told him to refuse entry and close the gate. The screaming continued for an hour before it changed pitch, became something less human and more guttural, and then stopped altogether as the person either wandered away or turned completely and lost interest in begging. The moral weight of that decision settled on all of us, but mostly on me because I'd established the command structure that made it possible. Created the hierarchy that allowed Frank to give orders through me and Marcus to follow them. We'd condemned someone to death based on a wound that might have been exactly what they claimed. Probably wasn't. Almost certainly wasn't given the timeline and circumstances, but might have been. There was a non-zero chance we'd just killed an innocent person through exclusion and caution. Frank found me sitting by the water an hour after dark, staring at the river reflecting starlight, and told me that doubt would get everyone killed. He'd made calls like that throughout his career. Wrong calls sometimes. Calls that haunted him during the quiet hours. But indecision was always wrong when lives depended on action, and action required decisiveness, even when information was incomplete. I asked him how he lived with it. He said poorly, but living poorly was better than not living at all, and regret was a luxury you could afford only after you'd survived long enough to have regrets. It wasn't comforting, but it was honest, and honesty was becoming a rare commodity in a world where everyone was lying to themselves about what they'd become. We established a routine over the next few days that transformed chaos into something resembling order. Guard rotations every 4 hours. Scheduled crossings for supply runs twice daily, morning and evening. Strict quarantine protocols for anyone new, involving the strip search and visual inspection that made everyone uncomfortable but kept everyone alive. The boats ran on schedule, carrying people who'd heard about the terminals through whatever communication networks were emerging from the ruins of infrastructure. Some came alone, some came in groups. All came desperate. We charged nothing at first, because the idea felt obscene, profiting from catastrophe, exploiting people at their most vulnerable. But supplies were finite, space was limited, and more people meant more mouths, more risk, more complexity in managing resources and security, and the 1,000 small problems that emerged when you tried to maintain civilization at a ferry terminal during an apocalypse. It was Derek who first suggested we couldn't save everyone, and maybe we shouldn't try. Lisa called him a monster. Marcus quietly agreed with him, which surprised me because Marcus had seemed like a decent guy. Frank stayed neutral, refusing to weigh in, telling me the decision was mine to make as the person who controlled the boats. I made the decision that would define my transformation from ferry operator to something else entirely, something I didn't have a name for yet, but that felt like a betrayal of every principle I'd held before the world ended. We would accept people, but they had to contribute. Skills, supplies, labor, or information. Nobody crossed for free because free was unsustainable, and unsustainable meant everyone died eventually. The first person I turned away was a woman with 3 kids and nothing to offer except need. She begged, explained that her husband was dead, her home was overrun, and she'd walked 40 miles along the river looking for somewhere safe. The children cried. The youngest couldn't have been more than 5. I told her we didn't have room, which was a lie. We had room. What we didn't have was infinite resources, and 4 more mouths when she couldn't contribute anything meaningful would strain systems already stretched too thin. Frank escorted her away from the fence, while I stood there feeling my humanity chip away piece by piece. Marcus put his hand on my shoulder afterward and told me I'd made the right call. I wanted to hit him. Instead, I walked away and threw up behind the maintenance shed, where nobody could see. The woman and her kids were gone by morning. I never learned what happened to them. I told myself I didn't want to know, but that was another lie. I wanted to know. I needed to know, but I couldn't face it, couldn't confront the direct consequences of my decisions, so I hid behind logistics and protocols in the fiction that I was making hard choices for the greater good. Word spread about the terminals faster than I'd anticipated. Within a week, we had people arriving daily, sometimes in groups of 10 or more, all seeking passage across the river. The north side had become increasingly overrun with the infected as survivors fled and the dead accumulated, making the south bank the preferred destination. But the south side had survivor settlements forming, which meant resources, trading opportunities, and relative safety in numbers. The river crossing became the gateway to survival, and I controlled the gate. Some people brought fuel in containers salvaged from gas stations, which we desperately needed despite having the depot. Others brought food, medicine, ammunition, tools, all the currencies of the New World. A few brought skills that were worth more than supplies. A mechanic named Ray, who could maintain the ferries and extend their operational life indefinitely. A former Army medic named Sarah, who established a proper medical station with sterilization protocols and triage procedures. A guy named Tom, who'd worked in logistics and could organize supply rationing efficiently, creating inventory systems and distribution schedules. We absorbed them, integrated them into the growing community, and the terminals transformed from desperate refuges into functioning outposts. But not everyone came offering fair trade. The first group that tried to take the terminals by force arrived in the middle of the night, 3 weeks after everything collapsed. 15 men arrived under cover of darkness, armed with hunting rifles and shotguns, demanding immediate access to the boats and fuel. They'd scouted us during daylight hours, observed our routines, counted our people, and decided that taking what we had was easier than negotiating for it. What they didn't anticipate was that Frank had been preparing for exactly this scenario since the day we'd secured both terminals. He'd grown up in a world where law meant something, but he'd adapted faster than any of us to a world where force was the only law that mattered. We'd established defensive positions over the preceding weeks, sandbag emplacements at key approaches, firing lanes with clear sightlines, watch rotations that ensured someone was always alert. We'd acquired weapons from survivors who'd traded them for passage, building an armory that would have seemed paranoid 3 weeks earlier, but now seemed barely adequate. The attack came at 2 in the morning, when they assumed we'd be at our weakest. They hit both terminals simultaneously, which showed coordination and planning that elevated them beyond simple opportunists. 8 attackers approached the north terminal. 7 targeted the south. Their strategy relied on overwhelming force and the element of surprise. They got neither. Our watch spotted them 300 yards out, gave the alarm, and defensive positions filled with people who'd been sleeping in their clothes with weapons within reach. Frank commanded the North Terminal response. I took the South. We'd wargamed this exact scenario, drilled the procedures, and everyone knew their assignments. The attackers reached the outer fence and started cutting through the chain link when we opened fire. Not warning shots, not aimed to wound. Center mass lethal intent, because anything less would get us killed. The first exchange dropped 3 of them in the initial volley. The rest scattered, taking cover behind vehicles and concrete barriers, returning fire that sparked off metal and punched through windows. The fight was brief and brutal and loud enough to wake anyone within a mile. We had superior positions and prepared defenses. They had numbers and aggression, and the desperation of people who'd decided violence was their only option. But desperation doesn't overcome tactical advantage when both sides are equally willing to kill. 6 of them died in the first 5 minutes. The rest retreated, regrouped somewhere in the darkness beyond our perimeter, and tried again at dawn with a different approach. They attempted to use one of our own boats against us, having circled around to an unguarded dock section. But Ray had removed critical engine components each night as a security measure. The boat wouldn't start. They were trapped on the pier when we counterattacked, and the ones who didn't die immediately jumped into the river where the current took them. We lost 1 person in the fighting, a kid named Tyler, barely 20, who'd been on watch at the South Terminal and took a round through his neck during the initial exchange. He bled out before Sarah could reach him, choking on his own blood while making sounds I'll never forget. His name was Tyler Brennan. He'd been trying to reach his family in California once things stabilized. He'd worked construction before the outbreak, played guitar, told jokes that weren't funny but made people laugh anyway because laughter was rare. We buried him near the river with no ceremony, because nobody knew any prayers and I'd have stopped them if they tried. Frank said a few words about duty and sacrifice that felt hollow, but necessary. We marked the grave with a wooden cross made from pallet boards, and I added Tyler's name to the list of people whose deaths I was responsible for through action or inaction. The reality of controlling the crossing became undeniably clear after that attack. We weren't just operators. We weren't just survivors. We were a power center in the emerging post-collapse landscape. The only reliable way across 100 miles of river meant we controlled trade, movement, and access to resources on both banks. People needed us more than we needed any individual person. That fundamental imbalance changed everything. I started charging higher rates for crossings, not because we needed more supplies immediately, though we always needed more, but because establishing value meant establishing power, and power meant security in a world where security was the only thing that mattered. Frank supported this completely, arguing that strength prevented challenges and weakness invited them. Marcus had reservations but kept them quiet, which I appreciated because dissent undermines authority, and authority was all that stood between us and chaos. Derek embraced the new pricing enthusiastically, which worried me more than I wanted to admit, because his enthusiasm felt less like pragmatism and more like enjoyment. Lisa left after I refused passage to an elderly couple who couldn't offer anything except photographs and memories, and the kind of desperate hope that died hard. She took her son, gathered what supplies she could carry, and walked away from the terminal compound without looking back. She called me a tyrant before she left, said I'd become the kind of person who made the world worse instead of better. said that survival without humanity wasn't survival worth having. I didn't argue because she wasn't wrong, and arguing would have required defending choices I couldn't defend, even to myself. I watched her walk away and did nothing to stop her, because stopping her would have meant confronting everything she represented. The ferry terminal compound expanded throughout the following months. We absorbed nearby buildings, pushed out the perimeter fence, established farming plots and cleared areas for long-term food production. Ray got creative with salvaged parts and extended the ferry engine's operational life indefinitely, solving problems with solutions that would have horrified marine safety inspectors, but worked perfectly well in a world without inspectors. Sarah set up a legitimate clinic in a cleared warehouse space that became crucial as injuries and illness increased throughout the region. She performed surgeries with sterilized tools, treated infections with rationed antibiotics, and saved lives that would have been lost without her expertise. Tom created a comprehensive trading system with standardized values for different goods, turning chaos into commerce and commerce into control. We evolved from desperate survivors into an organized operation that other settlements relied on for transportation and trade. With reliability came leverage. We brokered deals between North and South Bank communities, taking percentages for our facilitation. We controlled information flow because we talked to everyone who crossed, and everyone told us things they wouldn't tell others. We became intermediaries, arbiters, and eventually the de facto rulers of a small but strategically vital territory. Not everyone appreciated our position or the power we'd accumulated. A settlement called Riverside, about 20 miles south along the riverbank, sent representatives 3 months after the collapse, demanding we lower our crossing fees and guarantee them priority access during emergencies. I refused both demands politely but firmly. They threatened to build their own crossing, establish their own boats, and break our monopoly. I wished them luck and pointed out the realities they were ignoring. We controlled the only functional boats within 100 miles. We controlled the fuel depot that powered those boats. We controlled both banks at the only practical crossing point in this section of river. They'd have to move significant resources, construct vessels from scratch, establish infrastructure somewhere we couldn't interfere, and do all of it while defending against infected populations and rival settlements. The river was wide here, the current treacherous, and the infected population on the north bank made any construction project near suicidal. They knew it. I knew it. The meeting ended with them agreeing to our terms and me understanding that threats would continue to escalate because power generated opposition as reliably as fire generated smoke. I know you're wondering if I made it out. Stick with me because the next part will change how you see everything. The second major attack came from Riverside 4 months after the initial collapse. They'd coordinated with another settlement called Clearwater, pooled resources, gathered intelligence, and hit both terminals simultaneously with a combined force of about 40 people. This wasn't a night raid by opportunistic scavengers. This was an organized military assault with the specific goal of taking permanent control of the crossing. They wanted the ferries, the fuel, the strategic position, and the power that came with controlling the region's primary transportation bottleneck. What they got was a bloodbath that would define the territory's power dynamics for everything that came after. We'd spent months fortifying our positions based on lessons learned from the first attack. We had proper firing positions with overlapping fields of fire. We had supply caches positioned strategically. We had a defensive plan Frank had war-gained obsessively, running drills and scenarios until everyone knew their roles instinctively. We also had advance warning because one of their people had family in our compound and couldn't stomach participating in an attack that might kill relatives. The warning gave us hours to prepare, position people, check weapons, and steel ourselves for what was coming. The assault began at dawn with coordinated attacks on both terminals designed to split our forces and overwhelm our defenses through sheer numbers. They'd learned from the previous failed attack, approaching from multiple directions simultaneously to prevent us from concentrating fire. They used smoke grenades to obscure approaches. They had someone with military training coordinating their movements. It was professional, organized, and would have worked against a less prepared defense. But we'd been preparing for months. The assault failed within an hour, but it cost us 8 people and left both terminals damaged. Ray died holding the fuel depot, taking 3 attackers with him before a shotgun blast took half his face. Sarah survived, but lost 2 fingers to a ricochet while treating wounded in the makeshift medical station. Tom took a round through his shoulder that shattered bone and left his arm permanently weakened. Marcus caught shrapnel from a grenade and spent 3 days in surgical recovery. The attackers lost more than half their force, 23 dead, 6 captured. The rest fled back toward their settlements carrying wounded and the knowledge that they'd failed completely. Frank recommended we retaliate immediately, hit Riverside and Clearwater while they were weak and disorganized, make an example that would prevent future challenges to our authority. I spent 2 days thinking about it, weighing the calculus of violence, and ultimately agreed because the alternative was waiting for the next attack and the one after that until eventually they succeeded. We gathered 20 volunteers, armed them with the best weapons we'd captured, and organized a strike force under Frank's command. I stayed at the terminals because someone had to maintain operations, and I was still the only person who could pilot the ferries effectively. The raid on Riverside happened 3 days after their failed attack. Frank's team hit them at dawn, moving fast and hard, targeting leadership and infrastructure. They burned the settlement's food stores. They destroyed their water purification system. They killed anyone who resisted and captured anyone who surrendered. Frank returned with 16 prisoners and a clear message delivered to the surviving Riverside population. Challenge us again and we'll finish what we started. The prisoners were a problem I hadn't fully considered. We couldn't release them because they'd return home and rearm. We couldn't keep them indefinitely because feeding and guarding prisoners strained our resources. Frank suggested the obvious solution that nobody wanted to say out loud. I struggled with that decision longer than any other. These were defeated enemies who'd surrendered rather than fight to the death. Executing them violated every moral principle I'd been raised with, but releasing them guaranteed future conflict, and keeping them was unsustainable. I made the call. Frank carried it out. 16 people were taken beyond the perimeter and shot. We didn't bury them. We left the bodies where scavengers and infected would find them as a message to anyone else considering challenges to our control. That decision changed me in ways I'm still processing. Crossing the line from defensive violence to execution felt qualitatively different. It felt like becoming something I'd never intended to be. Derek congratulated me afterward, said it showed strength and decisiveness. His approval made me feel sick, because if Derek approved, I'd probably done something monstrous. The raid on Clearwater happened the following week with similar results. We broke their capacity for organized resistance, established dominance through overwhelming force, and made it clear that challenging the ferry terminals was suicide. Word spread throughout the region. The crossing was untouchable. The operators were ruthless. Trade through the terminals was safe but expensive, and crossing without authorization was impossible. We'd become exactly what we'd needed to become to survive, and in surviving, we'd lost whatever made survival worthwhile. The compound continued expanding. We had over 100 permanent residents by month 6, farming operations, workshops producing tools and ammunition, a school for the children who'd survived with their families. We'd built a functioning micro-civilization centered on controlling a strategic choke point, and that civilization required constant expansion to sustain itself. We established outposts up and down the river to watch for threats and opportunities. We sent trading missions to distant settlements, offering transportation services in exchange for resources and intelligence. We absorbed smaller survivor groups who couldn't maintain independence. The ferry crossing became the center of a network that stretched 50 miles in every direction, and I was at the center of that center, whether I wanted to be or not. Frank became my enforcer, handling security and external relations with a combination of diplomacy and threat. Derek ran the trading operations with an efficiency that probably involved corruption I chose not to investigate. Sarah managed medical services and maintained the fragile health of a population living in close quarters. Tom coordinated logistics, keeping supplies flowing and operations running. I piloted the ferries, made strategic decisions, and tried not to think too hard about what I'd become. 6 months into this new world, I still thought about Claire and Jake constantly. I'd sent scouts to Seattle and Eugene looking for information, offering rewards for any news about their status. 3 scouts went to Seattle, none returned. 2 went to Eugene. 1 came back with stories about university campus overrun within days of the outbreak, thousands of students trapped in dormitories that became tombs. No information about Jake specifically. The scout had looked, asked around survivor settlements near Eugene, but Jake was one name among thousands, and the chaos had been total. I held on to hope because hope was all I had, but hope eroded daily under the weight of probability. The odds they'd survived were minimal. The odds I'd ever see them again approached 0. I dealt with that grief by not dealing with it, by focusing on operations and decisions, and the 1,000 daily crises that came with managing a strategic territory during an apocalypse. What I did next haunts me still. If you've come this far, you need to see how it ends. The turning point came during month 7, when a large survivor convoy approached from the east, maybe 200 people in vehicles requesting mass passage across the river. They'd come from Idaho, been pushed west by infected hordes and rival groups, and needed to reach the coast, where rumors suggested military safe zones still existed. They had supplies to trade. They had skills. They had children, and elderly, and wounded. They were desperate but organized, led by a former National Guard officer named Colonel Patterson, who understood hierarchy and negotiation. We met at the North Terminal to discuss terms. Patterson wanted to move his entire convoy across over 2 days, paying standard rates, with guarantee of safe passage and no interference. I saw an opportunity. 200 people represented resources, labor, potential recruits, and, most importantly, leverage over other settlements who wanted what they had. I offered an alternative. They could cross, but instead of moving on immediately, they'd stay for 2 weeks contributing labor to expand our infrastructure. We needed more housing, more farming capacity, stronger defenses. In exchange, we'd provide food, security, medical care, and eventually passage when they'd fulfilled their obligation. Patterson refused, said his people needed to keep moving, that stopping meant dying, that he wouldn't subject his convoy to what amounted to forced labor. I told him those were my terms. Take them or find another crossing. He called me a petty warlord playing dictator over a ferry dock. He wasn't wrong, but being right didn't give him leverage. His people were exhausted, low on fuel, and couldn't survive prolonged travel. He agreed to my terms with visible anger, and I knew I'd made an enemy. The convoy stayed. We put them to work expanding the perimeter, building additional housing, reinforcing defenses. Patterson's people were skilled and organized, accomplishing in 2 weeks what would have taken our people 2 months. But tension ran high. His people resented the forced labor. My people resented sharing resources with outsiders. Derek saw opportunity for exploitation, charging the convoy members for everything from clean water to medical care beyond basic emergency treatment. I let it happen, because stopping it would have undermined Derek's authority, and I needed Derek's organizational skills, more than I needed to maintain moral consistency. Sarah objected, said we were betraying basic human decency, but she kept working because not working meant people died regardless of politics. The convoy's children integrated with ours in the compound school. Families formed connections. Some of Patterson's people expressed interest in staying permanently after seeing what we'd built. Patterson himself remained rigidly opposed, counting days until his obligation ended and he could move his people westward. On day 12, a scout reported a massive infected horde moving along the river from the north, maybe 1,000 strong, drawn by some unknown stimulus toward our position. We had 2 days before they'd reach the terminals. Patterson saw his opportunity. He offered a deal. His people would help defend against the horde, their combat experience and numbers providing crucial support, in exchange for immediate release from the labor obligation and priority crossing, once the threat was handled. I agreed, because refusing would have been suicidal. We spent the next 48 hours preparing for the largest defensive action since we'd secured the terminals. Every able-bodied person was armed and positioned. We created kill zones, established fallback positions, and prepared to defend everything we'd built against overwhelming numbers. The horde hit us at dawn on day 14. 1,000 infected moving with coordinated purpose, drawn by noise and activity, and the concentration of living humans. They crashed against our defenses in waves, climbing over each other, tearing at fences, reaching through gaps with hands that grabbed and pulled and wouldn't stop. We fired constantly, conserving ammunition as much as possible but burning through stockpiles faster than sustainable. The ferries were loaded with non-combatants ready to evacuate into the river if defenses collapsed. Patterson's people fought with professional efficiency that made the difference between holding and breaking. His shooters took controlled shots, his former soldiers organized defensive rotations, his medics treated wounded without hesitation. The battle lasted 6 hours. We killed hundreds of infected, and they killed 11 of our people, including 2 of Patterson's who died holding a breach in the fence. When it ended, the ground outside the perimeter was carpeted with bodies, and everyone was covered in blood and exhausted beyond rational thought. Patterson found me in the aftermath and demanded I honor our agreement. I told him his people were free to leave immediately. He asked if I'd learned anything from watching his people die defending my territory. I told him I'd learned that cooperation was possible when interests aligned, which probably wasn't the answer he wanted, but was the only honest one I had. The convoy departed the next morning, diminished by deaths and the people who chose to stay. Patterson didn't say goodbye, didn't shake my hand, just organized his reduced convoy and headed west toward the coast. And whatever fate waited there, I never learned if they made it. Never heard from Patterson again. But I thought about him constantly in the months that followed. Thought about his accusation that I'd become a warlord. thought about whether that assessment was accurate, or fair, or relevant in a world where power was the only currency that mattered. Month 8 brought winter and new challenges. The river began freezing at the edges, making crossings more dangerous. Food supplies diminished as farming operations went dormant. Fuel consumption increased as heating became necessary for survival. We established trade relationships with settlements throughout the region, becoming the hub of an economic network that stretched across what used to be 3 counties. We weren't just controlling a crossing anymore. We were controlling regional trade, mediating disputes, enforcing our version of order across territory we'd never formally claimed, but effectively ruled. I sat in the ferry terminal office that had become my headquarters, reviewing reports and making decisions that affected thousands of people, and wondered how I'd gotten here. I was a ferry operator. I'd spent 23 years piloting boats back and forth across a river, living a quiet life with a wife and son I might never see again. Now I was something else, something without a proper name. Not quite a governor, not quite a warlord, something in between that felt wrong but necessary. Frank came to me in month 9 with intelligence about a group called the River Council forming to the south. Representatives from 6 settlements organizing to challenge our control of the crossing, arguing that transportation infrastructure should be communal resources rather than private monopolies. They wanted to negotiate joint administration of the terminals, or, failing that, establish their own crossing through force if necessary. I asked Frank what he recommended. He said we should hit them preemptively, break the council before it consolidated power, make an example that prevented future organizational challenges. I asked what that would look like practically. He described raids on council settlements, targeted killings of leadership, destruction of infrastructure, and terror tactics that would make cooperation with the council suicidal. I asked if that made us better than the infected who destroyed the old world. He said, it made us survivors, and survival was the only metric that mattered. I spent a week struggling with that decision. We'd crossed so many lines already, executed prisoners, forced labor on refugees, established a protection racket disguised as trade agreements, but launching preemptive attacks against settlements that hadn't actually attacked us felt like a qualitative escalation. It felt like becoming the villains in someone else's story. On the other hand, waiting for the council to organize and attack meant fighting defensively with higher casualties and uncertain outcomes. Derek argued for Frank's approach, saying that strength prevented conflict and hesitation invited it. Sarah argued against it, saying we'd lose whatever humanity remained if we became aggressors rather than defenders. Marcus stayed neutral, exhausted by moral arguments when survival demanded pragmatism. I made the decision alone because that's what leaders do. They make decisions nobody else wants to make, and live with consequences nobody else has to bear. If this story made you feel something, fear, anger, or hope, drop a comment and share it with someone who needs to hear it. I authorized limited strikes against River Council leadership. Not massacres, not terror campaigns, targeted operations that removed key figures and disrupted organization. Frank's teams hit 3 settlements over 2 weeks, killing 5 council members and destroying their communications equipment. The council collapsed without its leadership, fragmenting back into independent settlements that lacked coordination or unified purpose. We'd won through violence and maintained our control through fear. I tried to feel relieved, but felt nothing except a growing numbness that made every decision easier and every day harder. Month 10 brought spring and renewal, and the first scouts from what claimed to be a reorganized government. Military personnel from a carrier group offshore, establishing contact with survivor settlements, offering protection and resources in exchange for cooperation and integration into an emerging federal structure. They arrived at the terminal with credentials and communication equipment and proposals for joint administration of strategic infrastructure. I met with their representatives, a Major Chen and a civilian administrator named Mr. Whitmore, who explained that the government was re-establishing authority along the coast and intended to bring order to the interior. The ferry crossing was strategic infrastructure that needed to be under proper authority rather than private control. They offered me a position as regional transportation coordinator in their emerging structure. They offered resources, security guarantees, and recognition of our compound as an official settlement. They offered a return to civilization and law and accountability. I asked what happened if I refused. Major Chen said refusal wasn't really an option given that they had military force and legal authority, and we were effectively squatters on government property. But he'd prefer cooperation because violence was expensive, and we'd demonstrated organizational capacity that would be valuable in reconstruction efforts. I told them I needed time to consider. They gave me 3 days. I gathered my leadership team and presented the situation. Frank wanted to fight, arguing that accepting federal authority meant losing everything we'd built and probably facing prosecution for actions we'd taken during the collapse. Derek agreed, seeing no benefit in surrendering power. Sarah argued for acceptance, saying a return to civilization was worth any personal cost. Tom pointed out that fighting the military was suicide, and cooperation was the only logical choice. Marcus said he'd follow my decision whatever it was, which was unhelpful, but appreciated. I made the decision by thinking about Claire and Jake. If they were alive, if they'd survived somewhere, they'd be trying to get home eventually. And home meant finding me, which meant I needed to be findable, needed to be part of whatever structures emerged, needed to exist within systems rather than outside them. I accepted federal authority on the condition that our people weren't prosecuted for actions taken during the collapse, and that I retained operational control of the crossing during the transition period. Major Chen agreed. Mr. Whitmore made it official with paperwork that felt surreal after months of operating outside any legal framework. The federal government took control of the terminal compound 2 weeks later. They brought soldiers, administrators, and bureaucrats who began transforming our improvised settlement into an official federal outpost. They brought accountability and oversight and restrictions that chafed after months of absolute authority. They brought law, which meant limitations but also protections. They brought the possibility of finding Claire and Jake through official search channels and survivor databases. I became Regional Transportation Coordinator, which was a fancy title for ferry operator, with additional responsibilities. Frank was absorbed into federal security forces, given a badge and authority that made his past actions officially sanctioned. Derek was pushed out, his corrupt trading operations shut down, and he left the compound bitter and threatening revenge that never materialized. Sarah thrived, given resources and support to expand medical operations beyond anything she'd managed independently. Tom continued managing logistics within the federal structure. Marcus went home to find his family, once transportation corridors reopened. I never learned if he found them. The compound continued growing under federal administration, becoming a major transportation hub and regional center. The crossing remained vital, and I remained essential to operating it, which gave me purpose and routine and enough distraction that I didn't think constantly about everything I'd done to survive. 6 months after federal reintegration, I received notification that Claire's name appeared in a Seattle survivor database. She was alive. She'd survived the conference, made it to a military safe zone, and was working as a nurse in a refugee hospital. We were reunited 3 weeks later, and neither of us was the same person we'd been before the collapse. Jake was listed as deceased in Eugene's survivor records, killed during the initial outbreak when dormitories were overrun, confirmed through multiple witness statements and partial identification of remains. We held a memorial service at the compound with federal representatives attending, and empty words about sacrifice and honor that meant nothing because my son was dead and I hadn't been there to protect him. Claire and I stayed together because staying together was easier than separating, but the distance between us was vast and growing. She'd spent the collapse saving lives. I'd spent it becoming something I couldn't fully explain or defend. We didn't talk about it, didn't process it, just existed in parallel, sharing space but not intimacy, partners in geography but not in understanding. I still operate the ferry, still make the crossing twice daily, sometimes more when demand is high. The terminals are secure now, properly defended by federal forces, and the infected population has been pushed back or eliminated throughout the region. Trade flows normally. People cross routinely. Civilization has returned in its imperfect, diminished form. But I remember those 10 months when I controlled the crossing, made life and death decisions, became a warlord in everything but name. I remember Tyler and Ray and the 16 prisoners we executed. I remember the woman with 3 kids I turned away. I remember Lisa calling me a tyrant and Patterson calling me a petty dictator, and both of them being right. I remember the person I became when circumstances demanded it, and I don't know if that person was necessary for survival or if I could have survived differently. I don't know if the choices I made were the only choices available or if I took the easy path and called it pragmatism. I don't know if I'm a survivor or a monster, or if there's any meaningful difference in a world where survival required monstrous acts. I just know that every time I pilot the ferry across this river, I think about the people who didn't make it, the ones I couldn't save and the ones I chose not to save, and I wonder if controlling the crossing was worth what it cost. The answer changes depending on the day. Most days, I think it wasn't worth it. Some days, I think survival is always worth it regardless of cost. Either way, I keep making the crossing because that's what ferry operators do. We transport people from one bank to the other, and we don't get to choose who deserves passage and who doesn't. Except I did choose. For 10 months, I chose constantly, and I'll carry those choices until I stop making crossings permanently.